Pinocchio is a story about parenthood and self-actualization, particularly about fatherhood and masculinity. I've thought about this since I saw Jordan Peterson's lecture on psychology of Pinocchio, the original one from the 1930s on YouTube maybe a year or two ago. And while it is really unavoidable if one is to make a good adaptation of that story, I didn't expect Del Toro's Pinocchio to not only follow the ideas of the original, but actually expand on them and make them slightly more relevant to our time. It has some serious messages and warnings within it about masculinity and fatherhood that it explores through each character, their beliefs and their relationships, especially their relationship with the young boys, Pinocchio, Carlo, and Candlewick. For a brief summary, we have Geppetto, who represents a good but imperfect father, we have Volte, who represents an exploitative father, and Podesta, who represents a weaponizing father.
Ciao, Papa.
Geppetto represents good fatherhood, but also imperfect, as we all are, which is interesting because he also seems to be a bit of a perfectionist. You can see it in how he talks about the pine cone, saying that it has to be perfect and that it can't be used for building because one of it is missing its scales. And him saying that that wood is not fit for building is funny because it's the very same wood and with a bit of imperfection that he uses to build his son Pinocchio. Geppetto definitely has a very high standard, but he ultimately loves Pinocchio and eventually learns how to properly communicate with him over the story. And Pinocchio also learns to listen to him and control himself and gets a sense of honor, especially after being disappointed by Podesta and Volte, which leads us into the first really toxic father figure, Podesta. Podesta is weaponized fatherhood. Podesta is first of all a relatively unassuming man in the village who eventually becomes a military officer fighting for and training boys, including his own son, to fight for the fascist regime in Italy at the time. He sells war to them as this beautiful thing that they are doing, fighting for the fatherland. There's that word again. And he's essentially into weaponizing fatherhood as the state and culture of the time does, by essentially influencing and even at certain point bullying his son and a bunch of the other boys and Pinocchio into expressing a masculinity that would be useful to the state and to the war, and not one that would actually make them better, happy people. We also see how those expectations not only strain the relationship between Candlewick and his father, but also cause Candlewick to become something of a psychological bully to Pinocchio, as Podesta sees Pinocchio as a better man, a better figure, a better person than his own son because of his invulnerability, because of his inability to die. And then ultimately his want to impress his father dies when he's asked to kill Pinocchio and refuses. But on the other hand, something that we usually excuse, something that I think is even worse, is a person like Volte. Volte, who is exploitation of fatherhood. He is a father figure of sorts to Pinocchio, but only seeks to tempt him and feed his excesses while he uses his strengths and exploits him for his show at the carnival. Yes, he does give Pinocchio the stardom and attention that he wants, just like most people would want, but he does it for malicious purposes to exploit him and then turns against him violently when Pinocchio tries to leave. He's also literally the devil, and he is this movie's version of the character in the original that tells the fox that he's going to sell the boys to Pleasure Island. We see him literally reenact the devil's temptation of Jesus from the Bible, as he literally tempts him when he says that he should want to be on a stage and revel as they bow at his feet.
You shall see all the nations of the earth for yourself as they bow at your feet.
My brand new feet.
But let's consider the character of Pinocchio and by contrast Carlo, the children, the people who are being formed by these interactions. Carlo is Geppetto's first son, a boy who only ever listened to a good father, versus Pinocchio, who is more of a free thinker and wants to explore the world, partially because he sees himself as invulnerable, which is arguable. I mean, he can't die, but he can be something worse. He can be corrupted. Carlo is someone who immediately and always looked up to his father, and perhaps it's because he is always and immediately loved, while Pinocchio is first of all feared and then berated and then called a burden, and so he goes in seek of validation and expression somewhere else. This video is not just going to be a rambling or a teaching. I'm stating things that I can see, and then I would also like you guys to comment below what you think about how these ideas are shared between the movie. It's not that Pinocchio is a bad boy, it's actually more that he starts off with a bad relationship with his father, and so he seeks other men out as father figures who turn out to be some of the worst people, unfortunately. It's a warning sign of sorts about fatherhood and responsibility, and about fatherhood and its responsibility for shaping masculinity. I noticed that Carlo died because he went back for the pine cone with imperfections when Geppetto told him they had to leave. Small hint at the link between the cause of tragedy and the moral lesson, I think. There's also this thing that happens very early on in the movie where they keep doing this interesting editing that creates a parallel between Jesus and Pinocchio, and I wonder what Del Toro is reaching for this. Maybe he's expressing that Jesus is also now a wooden boy who was once a real boy and who listened to his father and followed his mission at all costs, and maybe it's pointing out that it's necessary that fatherhood and masculine maturity is not necessarily a smooth road even when you have a good father, but maybe it will be a fulfilling one. And it's a lesson that Pinocchio has to learn, as he says,
Stop! You must obey your papa.
Obey?
Do as you're told.
But I don't want to obey.
and obeying is exactly what Jesus does with the words of his own father. He's not forced, he's not a puppet, but he does allow himself to be submitted to the wisdom of his father. There's some overall lessons in the messages that I'm getting here. The overall lesson, I think, of the relationship between Voltaire and Pinocchio is that sometimes people will pretend that they want the best for you so that they can exploit you while feeding you excesses as a person. We see that today in the modern day, I think, with figures like Andrew Tate. I think also the fact that Voltaire wants to make Pinocchio an actor, and that may be a direct jab at what tends to happen in media industry and how people are propped up on stages and given these platforms, and it might look like they are living the life that they always wanted, but perhaps they are just puppets, or at least they have to be wary of just becoming puppets. But it's not just the media industry, it's maybe industry as a whole. People talk about godfathers, people talk about getting connections. The issue is just that not all these relationships are necessarily beneficial to both parties. A lot of times they end up being very exploitative because one person has more power than the other, and the father, the guardian, and mold the son into their own image. I think the overall lesson of the relationship between Podesta and Pinocchio and his own son, Candlewick, is that sometimes fatherhood and patriarchy is used to hold men to a standard of being that's quite frankly destructive and, to use common language, toxic. It shows us the evil that is how young men have been coerced into being excited for war and then sent onto the battlefield to be slaughtered, while their fathers, the high-ranking officials, sit in safety and comfort, ready to send out the next group of young men who will be held to their devilish and self-destructive standards. And I think the overall lesson of the relationship between Geppetto and Pinocchio is that there aren't necessarily perfect fathers or sons, but there are some that are better than others, and they should be cherished. Geppetto also needed to learn that his son is not a puppet as much as Pinocchio needed to learn that perhaps listening to someone wiser than him is actually something good that he should take seriously. And then going back to the parallel between Jesus and Pinocchio that Del Toro does, is very interesting because certainly God doesn't think of Jesus like a puppet. He gave him the ability to choose, and that's something that all fathers and parents should learn to cherish within their children. So I hope that this video didn't come off as too much of a ramble. It was just me sharing some thoughts that I had about Pinocchio and its messages. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe for more videos on Disney movies and film and cinema in general. And if you would like to support the channel, please consider leaving a donation below.